The Prime Minister is right to recognise that immediate support needs to be combined with longer-term action. But I'm afraid fracking and a dash for gas in the North Sea will not cut bills, nor strengthen our energy security, but they will drive a coach and horses through our efforts to fight the looming climate crisis. She should listen to her own Chancellor sitting next to her. What did the Chancellor have to say about this just a few months ago? Now, this is quite a long quote. See the Chancellor leaning forward. I've tried to cut it down. But every sentence is worth repeating of what the Chancellor said just a few months ago, his words. For those calling for its return, they misunderstand the situation we find ourselves in. If we lifted the fracking moratorium, it would take up to a decade to extract sufficient volumes, and it would come at a high price for communities and our precious countryside, his words. I'll go on because this is so good. Second, he said just a few months ago, no amount of shale gas from hundreds of wells dotted across rural England would be enough to lower the European price any time soon. And he went on. And with the best will in the world, private companies are not going to sell shale gas they produce to UK consumers below the market price. They are not charities. Spot on, Chancellor. And what did the Chancellor at the same time have to say about North Sea gas? Additional North Sea production won't materially affect the wholesale price. Indeed, earlier this year, his previous department helpfully put out a series of Mythbusters, a government myth-busting document. Here's one of them. Chancellor, your document. Myth. Extracting more North Sea gas lowers prices. Answer. Fact. UK production isn't large enough to materially impact on the global price of gas. I've got a copy for the Prime Minister. We do need to carefully manage our existing resources in the North Sea, and the industry has an important role to play in our future as we transition to a different form of energy. But doubling down on fossil fuels is a ludicrous answer to a fossil fuel crisis. And if all countries took the approach advocated by her new Energy Secretary of squeezing every single drop out of their fossil fuel reserves, global temperatures will rise by a catastrophic 3 degrees. That will be devastating for our planet and future generations. And it's totally unnecessary. Now, I'm going to make some progress because I do think other speakers need to get in. New wind and solar power are now 9 times cheaper than gas. 9 times cheaper. So we need a clean energy sprint, urgently accelerating the rollout of offshore wind, onshore wind, solar, nuclear, hydrogen and tidal.
We have made important progress in this over recent years. I refer, of course, to the investment in Hinkley Point C, and I again welcome the commitment that my right honourable friend and the government have made to continuing that commitment to support nuclear energy. And as I pointed out in my intervention, just wait a second. Well, that's more than 1 second, but anyway. As I pointed out in my intervention to the Right Honourable Leader of the Opposition, and was emphasised by the excellent intervention by my Right Honourable friend, the Member for Forest of Dean, in 13 years of government, whatever the then Leader of the Labour Party might have said, they did not build any new nuclear capabilities. I will wait.
I thank her for giving way. On Hinkley Point C, it's going to be at least 4 years late, possibly 5 years late. It's nearly 50% over budget, and EDF have got an eye-watering 35-year contract for a strike rate at £92.50 per megawatt, compared to roughly £40 per megawatt for just 15 years in onshore and offshore wind. She should have scrapped Hinkley Point C when she had the chance, shouldn't she?
We now come to the Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, at the start of the year, we were faced with an energy crisis. By the summer, it was an emergency. Right now, today, we're at the precipice of a humanitarian disaster. Because it's no longer a question of whether to heat or eat. when many households can no longer afford to do either.
Would the honourable gentleman give
This, let me make some progress on it, and I will. This cost crisis puts livelihoods and lives at risk. And all the while, as this disaster deepened, all summer the Tories spent all their time desperately fighting amongst themselves, and the public were left desperately waiting for a real cost of living plan. We finally have a plan today, but I fear that when the public absorb the details, it will fall far short of what help they need. Now, we've heard today that the green levies are being scrapped, and that is something that is of deep concern to those of us on these benches, particularly given that the green levies fund the warm discount scheme and, of course, energy efficiency measures for low-income households. And I want to ask the Government to make sure that that support will remain in place for those that need it. But, Mr Speaker, the sheer scale of those soaring energy bills meant that there was never any question that households and businesses couldn't be able to pay the cost of energy bills. They were and they are unaffordable. If these prices weren't frozen, the bills simply couldn't have been paid. So, freezing prices wasn't really a choice. It's the only political option. And when the current price cap stands at £2,000 with a 54% increase since spring, and many people are already unable to pay, setting the cap at £2,500 isn't an actual freeze. We know too that businesses, especially SMEs, are facing even sharper cost increases than households, and an avalanche of insolvencies and redundancies is forecast. Many businesses simply could not have afforded to stay open.
To the right honourable gentleman. On the question of the cap, the Prime Minister indicated that one of our reviews is going to be on regulation. Does the right honourable gentleman think it's time to take a serious look at the operations of Ofgem, and for a regulator, how much support they're giving to consumers, whether it's domestic consumers or businesses?
I think it's fair to say that the current regime is not fit for purpose, and it's why we're in the situation that we are today. So an urgent review of that is absolutely required. Mr Speaker, in reality, the one big political question, the real question, was how today's plan would be paid for and who would pay for it. And ever since the new Prime Minister took office, we've been waiting for these answers. But after all the waiting, it couldn't be any clearer. She set it out very brazenly. The Prime Minister's plan means that the public pays. She has made the political choice to tax families instead of companies, to put profit over people. Instead of a windfall tax, she's chosen a new Tory tax, the trust tax. The trust tax that means that in the months and years ahead, households and businesses will be punished with higher bills, higher interest rates and higher mortgage costs. A trust tax means it cuts to the vital public services people rely on and which are used to support the most vulnerable. A trust tax means a threat to the Scottish budget, which the Scottish Government is using to protect our population and shield workers and public services as best they can. Mr Speaker, the frightening bit for people is that the new Prime Minister made this choice on day one in the job. Because on day one, we saw the pound slip to a low not seen since the Thatcher years, knocked by the UK's worsening economic outlook. On day one, her first major decision as Prime Minister will see big business profits prioritised over family budgets. And on day one, we can already predict that the trust tax paid for by households for the years to come will be the Prime Minister's enduring legacy, eating away at household budgets long after she and her party have been voted out of office. If day one was that bad, you couldn't blame people for fearing that the worst is yet to come. Mr Speaker, the decision not to bring in an additional windfall tax is the biggest and the worst political choice in this plan. Because let's look at Shell and BP as an example. Now, I want corporates to be able to be profitable to invest, to create jobs and to finance a green transition. But there is a difference between a fair profit and an excess windfall or excess profit. Mr Speaker, Shell's first-half profits were up by 177% to $25.2 billion. Shell were making excess profits to such an extent they brought back shares worth $8.5 billion and declared that they would buy back a further $6 billion worth of shares between July and September. If you want the example of where the excess profit is, Mr Speaker, then there it is. In total, this means that $14.5 billion of excess profits not being invested in green energy projects, money that's been generated from high energy prices, that our constituents and our businesses have to pay. That is the reality. Then let's take a look at British Petroleum. Q2 profits up from $3.1 billion to $9.2, and a share buyback for this quarter of $3.5 billion. You know, Mr Speaker, quite frankly, that will disgust our constituents, that money has been given back to shareholders at a time that people quite simply can't afford to put their heating on. These are global corporates, but we can and should fairly tax their UK activities. So why on earth is the Prime Minister failing to bring in a fair windfall tax? Why are ordinary people right across these islands ultimately going to have to foot these bills? Why does her plan not address that real issue? Mr Speaker, this energy plan is not only defined by the choice it makes to make the public pay instead of the excess profits of massive corporations. It is also defined by its glaring omissions, because there is no proper plan to help those that are already struggling. Support needs to be targeted to low-income households and those negatively impacted by spiralling costs, such as unpaid carers, larger households and disabled people. In Scotland, we are already prioritising this support to the most vulnerable. The Scottish Government is doing what it can, freezing rents, banning evictions, freezing train fares, expanding free school meals to Primary 6 and Primary 7. That's a government acting with compassion.
I'd like to thank my honourable friend for making the most valid point, that the working people across these islands will be paying for generations to come for this borrowing, for excess greed, described by the UN Secretary-General as utterly grotesque and immoral, to be making excess profits on the back of fossil fuels. And what I've heard from this government today is more of the same. The question I want to ask is, has the government put any conditions, despite their ideology that profits must be made regardless, have they put any conditions on these excess profits on what they're going to do in investment to a rapid transition so it saves all our future generations from the climate catastrophe?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right. And, you know, in the context of this, we're doing what we can with the devolved powers that we have. And let me say to the government that one of the things that we have done is introduce the game-changing Scottish child payment, which will be increased to £25 a week, lifting 50,000 children in poverty out of poverty in Scotland. But I need to make progress. But we're all too aware that this is nowhere near enough to mitigate the effects of this crisis, because most of the key economic levers lie here at Westminster. So, if the new Prime Minister is serious about helping everyone through this winter, she should at the very least lift universal credit by £25 a week. Whilst I welcome the remarks of the Prime Minister on those on off-grid, we must be given clarity over support for those across swathes of rural Scotland who are reliant on oil heating and who are not subject to the price cap. Clarity is also needed to those who have accepted fixed-term contracts at a higher rate in a bid to weather the storm. They must be allowed to switch to benefit from the support that's been put in place. And crucially, vital support for the most vulnerable must go hand in hand with the UK Government to increase budgets of the devolved administrations or grant them greater powers to borrow so that they can do more to help all public service workers and the most vulnerable. I'm
grateful to the right honourable gentleman who's making a very broad and apposite speech. He was challenged on the rate of tax that he believed was appropriate. But of course, he will also know that prior to the introduction of the windfall tax, the UK had the lowest tax rate of any oil and gas producer in the world. 65%, which is what he was challenged on, is actually 6 percentage points below the average of all producers in the world. So even if you were prepared to go to the global average, it would still mean that relief could be given to taxpayers in this country.
I have to say that the honourable gentleman makes an awful lot of sense with his intervention. And what we should be reflecting on is that these are oil and gas companies that are making additional profits, not because they're improving their businesses, not because they're investing, but quite simply because the oil and gas prices are higher. And it's quite right in the context of that our consumers, our businesses are compensated. Why on earth are we sitting back allowing the oil and gas companies to engage in billions and billions of dollars of share buybacks? Mr. Speaker, I want to make progress because I'm conscious of the time and those that want to speak. I want to briefly deal with another prominent point in the Prime Minister's speech, because the Prime Minister blames the cost of living crisis on the war in Ukraine, and I believe that this issue is worth expanding on. And of course, there is no doubting that what has happened in Ukraine has had a major role in spiralling wholesale prices. And we have rightly come together across this chamber in condemnation of Putin's horrific war and his actions to thwart European energy supply. And I look forward to continuing to work with the new government in a spirit of consensus on this issue. We all stand together against Putin's horrible actions, the war in Ukraine. But as we've rightly helped Ukraine, we must also help citizens at home. Indeed, we owe it to them to do so. And I would hope that the Prime Minister will reach consensus with me on this point. But where we divide is what I believe we must recognise that other countries in Europe, far more reliant on Russian gas than the UK, have weathered the economic storm far better than the United Kingdom. And we must therefore recognise the UK government's role in creating the circumstances for this crisis.
We'll take it away.
Shameful mismanagement by a successive Tory government stopped by a Tory Brexit means that the UK has the highest inflation in the G7, the lowest growth in the G20, and we're marching headlong into a recession. UK household electricity prices have surged ahead of European peers, and the UK is now in a deeper state of crisis than most because of the damaging choices that have been made.
We don't need it. Scotland doesn't need it. It's that shit.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. Does he share my view that for my constituents in North Ayrshire and Arran, the most important aspect of this announcement today is that as they were waiting to hear of help with their fuel bills as they live in difficulty, what they've been told today is that their fuel bills will rise and they will be bitterly disappointed by this, and nothing has been offered to them today. Does he agree with that disappointment?
Yes, I do. And of course we need to reflect that these energy bills in Scotland are rising in an energy-rich Scotland. Yep. The damage of the choices that the UK government has made, choices that have been imposed upon us, make the choice of Scotland's future ever clearer.
We'll take it away.
Because Scotland is energy-rich, we simply shouldn't be facing an emergency. Mr Deputy Speaker, it may surprise some in this House, but Scotland produces 6 times more gas than we consume, and almost 100% of our entire electricity production comes from renewables. That's not attention-seeking, Prime Minister. These are the facts. Scotland has the energy. We just simply don't have the powers. We are stuck in a UK market that prices our electricity based on the price of wholesale gas, and the power to change the system lies with Westminster.
I thank him for giving way, and of course he'll also know that although we are producing almost 100% of our energy from renewable sources, the grid connection charges that are £7.36 per megawatt hour compared to 40 pence per megawatt hour in England doesn't help further investment.
Incredible.
We need these grid connection charges to be reduced, because my constituents want to know, when they can see windmill or wind turbines outside their windows, why are their prices going up?
Well, again, my honourable friend makes a very, very important point. We're being ripped off on Scotland's ability to deliver green renewable energy. But it's even worse than that. Because for those of us that live in the north of Scotland, because we have a regional distribution market, we pay a premium for the electricity that was sent south. We then have to pay the highest prices to get it back. That's the cost to people in Scotland of Westminster's control of our energy market. So what is needed, most crucial of all, and what is glaringly lacking in this energy plan, is fundamental overhaul of the energy market to break the link between cost of gas and the price of renewable and low-carbon electricity. The reality, Mr Deputy Speaker, is that an independent and an energy-rich Scotland, with the normal powers to act in our own interests, could have cushioned our economy from this cost-of-living crisis. Through independence, Scotland could use our energy well for the benefit of our people. So for households and businesses in Scotland, the cost of living crisis is literally the cost of living with Westminster. It is a cost we can no longer afford, and it is a price we are no longer willing to pay. It's why Scotland's people will choose independence.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Although the solutions to this crisis may sound complicated in this debate, the choice is straightforward for the government. Who pays at the end of the day? And let's be clear what a windfall tax is. It's not taxing the profits of energy companies that they had planned for and that could be expected in all reason. This is a windfall that has come about, as the government has said itself, as a consequence of what is happening in the Ukraine, the aggression by Putin. And the question that I have, and that my constituents will have, is how can the government reasonably come to a conclusion that it is okay for those energy companies to make these huge profits on the back of that aggression by Putin? And this is not as if it's a windfall for the government. This is going to cost the taxpayer through the government, no matter what we do over the windfall tax. And the government is under pressure in other areas of expenditure. We only have to look at the newspapers today about yet again, the numbers of people waiting for operations in the NHS has gone up again to 6.8 million people waiting. We can see in the papers today about the teachers' assistants in schools, where they are being forced, because of the cost of living, to question whether they can stay committed to supporting children in the schools and move to higher paid jobs in places like supermarkets. Everything, where you look, the government is under pressure over public expenditure on our vital public services. Yet when it comes to this, they're prepared to just wave aside the potential to pay for these increases. But this statement says that there will be assistance equivalent to that given to individuals for businesses, guaranteed for 6 months. And the Prime Minister, I wrote the words down, said that businesses would be given some idea of what assistance they will get in 3 months. Well, they're negotiating now. I mean, we got no clarity from the Prime Minister in her statement. It was like she was making a Queen's speech, my government will. But she gave us no detail on actually what these government ministers will be doing. And one of the things I want to guarantee on is if we're going to get a financial statement from the government next week, or towards the end of this session before we break again for conferences, will there be a proper debate in here on that financial statement as we're required to have? Or will the government avoid scrutiny yet again? Because that's been a repeated action by the government.
The Speaker, and I rise to broadly welcome these measures. We know that we live in terribly difficult times. Yesterday, the Treasury Committee took evidence from the Governor of the Bank of England and other members of the NPC, and the point was made that the impact of these energy rises on households is about 4 times that which occurred in the 1970s. These are truly frightening times, and so I'm very pleased that my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, has come forward with such a bold package of measures, both for consumers but also critically for businesses over the next 6 months, with a review after 3. I was pleased to see the Bank of England facility, the liquidity facility for energy businesses totalling £40 billion, which I think would be very important in terms of the functioning of the marketplace, and also this critical commitment to review the way in which the pricing of our electricity is determined, whether it be in relation to gas or the actual underlying costs of alternative means of energy production. I did want to focus briefly, Mr. Deputy Speaker, on the macroeconomic issues here, which are easy to overlook. This is a huge intervention. The Prime Minister detailed that the Chancellor would come forward with those costings at the emergency fiscal event that he is to present to the House soon. Now, that in terms including, or alongside, should I say, the tax reductions that have been mooted, plus the other pressures on the public finances, mean that debt is most certainly going to increase, as is the deficit. And whilst it has been stated that inflation will be assisted by these measures, which is true, inflation, of course, is just a measure of price rises relative to a previous period at a particular point in time. And whilst it may be the case that the downward pressure on the CPI from these freezes will be positive, it will be a stimulus to the economy, and through time, Mr. Deputy Speaker, inflation may actually net increase. Now, that will require a response from our central bank, which may see interest rates in the more medium term increasing with increased servicing costs for our debt. So I think we need to see this very much in the round, and this is where I think this debate around the windfall tax actually should be at least considered, and the Treasury Committee will be looking at that in some detail. The final point I wish to make in my remaining 30 seconds is I think it's critical that when it comes to the emergency fiscal event, we do have an OBR independent forecast to take into account all of these issues, the great uncertainty that we're talking about, these huge fiscal interventions which have yet, the costings have not been presented to us. We need to see what the impact of that is going to be on the public finances in order to reassure the markets. Thank you.
Sir Ed Davey.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, following the Speaker's statement earlier, I think all our hearts and thoughts and prayers are elsewhere, but I do want to contribute to the debate and to actually agree with the Honourable Member for the Forest of Dean on his questions on heating oil. I think that's a critical issue for many, many people in rural communities, and we do need answers, and we need them immediately. Mr. Deputy Speaker, what the Prime Minister has just announced is not a freeze on people's energy bills. In the middle of a cost of living emergency, the Conservatives are choosing to put energy bills up by another £500 for struggling families. This hike in people's energy bills comes on top of the £700 rise we saw last April. Struggling families will be paying twice as much for energy as they were last year. People will still be desperately worried about how they're going to keep warm this winter. Last May's £400 discount simply won't make up for this enormous rise in energy bills. So where is the new support for families and pensioners who are struggling? Under the Prime Minister's plan, Mr. Deputy Speaker, fuel poverty will get worse, not better. And turning to the way we think she's proposing to pay for this package, why does it seem the government is handing an eye-watering bill to taxpayers in the form of higher borrowing, which we all know ultimately means higher taxes for taxpayers and particularly for our children? This doesn't seem conservative, doesn't seem right. Why has she rejected the alternative of a windfall tax on today's oil and gas giants, who are raking in enormous, unexpectedly high profits thanks to President Putin's invasion of Ukraine? How is it fair, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to take money from future taxpayers, from our children, and to hand it to today's oil and gas barons? How is it responsible to borrow so much to pay for consumption when our economy is already in such a mess, with the pound falling so dangerously? And on energy policy, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the fair and responsible policy is to increase investment massively in the cheapest and most popular forms of energy available to us, wind and solar. I was absolutely shocked that the Prime Minister did not announce a massive expansion, a fast expansion of renewables to bring people's energy bills down. Mr Deputy Speaker, the Prime Minister has made some alarming choices today, rejecting cheap wind and solar power, raising people's energy bills even higher than they are now, refusing extra support for struggling families and pensioners, and paying for a policy with higher taxes on our children instead of a windfall tax on fossil fuels. These are the wrong choices.
Lucas. Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I echo the best wishes to Her Majesty. The new Prime Minister takes up her role at a moment when the country is facing a series of multiple crises of staggering proportions, including a likely recession and, let's not forget, the accelerating climate emergency, which, in the words of the IPCC, means that there is, and I say, a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. So this moment required bold, visionary thinking, grounded in compassion, not cold and outdated economic dogma. It called for a retrofit revolution, a massive investment in the home insulation and renewable energy upgrades that could finally deliver warm homes and lower bills. I was staggered that the Prime Minister didn't mention once those demand-side measures that need to be put into the communities around our country so that people can finally have lower bills and warmer homes. What it did not call for were measures that would lock us into further dependence on fossil fuels. Because while Putin's war in Ukraine has accelerated this crisis, it is fundamentally one caused by our dependence on gas, and it won't be solved by extracting more gas, and it certainly won't be solved by a resumption of fracking, which would be a disaster for the climate, and a measure which, as her own Chancellor admitted barely 6 months ago, would do nothing to lower energy bills and would fail to produce enough gas to meet even 1% of our needs for more than the next 3 years. Coming to the detail of her support package, I welcome the fact that she has finally acted on a price freeze, but these measures are nowhere near enough. They are poorly targeted and, without a substantial package of additional support, will fail to protect millions of low-income families who are already in freefall. They can't cope with current prices, never mind an increase, and that's why my party would return the price cap to its more affordable rate of last October. These measures do nothing to incentivise a reduction in demand, energy demand for those who can do that. And most staggering of all, as we've heard so much, they allow the oil and gas companies to get off scot-free, despite the Treasury's own documents showing that energy producers are in line to make $170 billion in excess profits over the next 2 years. So what we need to do is to scrap the shameful investment allowance, put in a windfall tax that is proportionate to the crisis that we face, and make that the first step towards a permanent carbon tax on oil and gas companies to reach, at the very least, the global average of 70%. That would bring the UK in line with countries such as Angola and Trinidad. I want to say I welcome the fact that the government has been consulting on decoupling the price of renewables from gas. That would be a game-changing step. But I also want to ask her to do a massive investment in renewable energy. Renewables are a staggering 9 times cheaper than gas. There are 650 wind and solar projects oven-ready and waiting. That is the way forward, not putting us into more and more fossil fuels. And finally, will the government look at measures like a rising block tariff approach, which would be much fairer into the future? Stephen Lloyd Russell-Moyle.
Madam Deputy Speaker, some of the announcements are welcome, particularly a focus on people who are not on the grid. I would like to highlight to the front bench, and I do hope that they will go away and seek more clarity, for people who resell energy, often landlords in blocks who buy the energy on the commercial market and resell it to their tenants. It's never been explicitly mentioned by the government. They've talked about heat networks, which is if the landlord is running a boiler, but not if you are supplying the electricity directly to that flat. Those meters are not on the official meter grid. They will not be eligible for the £400 support from this government even at the moment, unless action is taken. There needs to be some urgent action there to ensure that the landlords can purchase the prices at fair prices and they pass them on. At the moment, the landlord has to pass it on at the purchase price. I'm not saying landlords are gouging, but there is a problem that the purchase price is a commercial price, not a residential price. So I do hope that they will come back with further clarity on that. But the reality is that this package still is a £500 increase on what energy bills are today. Yes. This is not a reduction, this is an increase, and it didn't need to be like this. It didn't need to be like this because we could have regulated the wholesale market price and the government could have stepped in and offered loans to energy companies to bridge the gap for the gas that they are importing. That could have been the offer, where the debt was put on the energy companies, not on the state, but that wasn't what has been put forward today. We could have seen the government fixing energy prices at what they are today and making interventions, but they didn't see that either. And so there are some real difficulties with this about who pays. Is it the profits of the companies, or is it the backs of the people? And I'm afraid the wrong choice has been made, because future generations, and even this generation in future years, will be paying for this, and that does not seem right to me.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
Under Prydarydd, mi hoffwn yn anfon dymuniad agorau I Yw Marwedi Efrenhinas. I too would like to send my best wishes to Her Majesty the Queen. Today's announcement shows beyond doubt whose side the new Prime Minister is on. She's prepared to force taxpayers to carry the burden of borrowing billions of pounds in order to subsidise the shareholders of energy companies who are profiting from Putin's war. And it's shocking she can't even tell us how much that burden is going to cost today. I must urge her to think again. Make energy companies pay their fair share. The global energy norm of energy profit taxation is 70%. Norway stands at 78%. Why does the population of the UK have to suffer the combined yokes of higher taxes, worse public services and falling real wages while private profit is protected under her premiership? Use that money to return the energy price cap to the pre-April level of £1,277 per year and extend that cap to small businesses and charities. People are struggling now. Even at current prices, 180,000 households in Wales are forced to struggle even to afford items such as heating, food and toiletries. Bills of £2,500 are unaffordable for many, many people. Anything short of £1,277 as a cap will fail to meet the scale of the crisis we face. And it will require her government, and this is important, to bring forward additional packages of support for vulnerable households, including doubling the £650 cost of living payment and revising the eligibility criteria to include those on disability benefits who are currently excluded from support. This will cost us more in future if we don't face what is genuinely facing us now. But, of course, what we're calling on her here is, instead of pursuing fantasy economics of rampant deregulation and tax cuts for the rich, the Prime Minister must also prioritise reduction in energy demand and investment in low-carbon sources. That's the only way to bring down energy bills in the medium and long term. Finally, and to be clear and simple on this, it is time to unchain Wales's renewable and low-carbon energy potential by vastly improving our grid capacity, bringing forward SMRs at Transfynydd in my constituency and Wilver and other places as well, empowering Welsh Government to deliver large-scale transformative infrastructure projects such as tidal lagoons, devolving management of the Crown Estate to Wales and enabling community energy schemes to realise their full potential by selling their power directly to local customers. For us in Wales, it is now clear that in the long term, to fix this crisis for good, we must place our energy system and its huge potential in the hands of the people of Wales for the benefit of the people of Wales.
Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I paid particular attention to the very, very small note which came out from the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy earlier, and the particular line that says this will save the typical household £1,000 a year. £1,000 a year. Madam Deputy Speaker, it's almost like the cap which is being put in place at £2,500 a year isn't double what energy prices were just last summer. It's almost as if the government doesn't understand the sheer scale of the financial problems facing households right across the country. Because, of course, it's not just about energy prices. Inflation is at a 40-year high. Interest rates are at a 30-year high. Wages are at a 20-year low. And yet we're being told we should be happy about energy bills being frozen at £2,500 per year. It's absurd. It's not just households who are going to be struggling, it's obviously going to be businesses as well. We've heard a number of businesses spoken about in the chamber here today, and I think I've spent most of the summer having emails from businesses who are being utterly crippled by the costs that are in front of them. And up till now, the government hasn't even lifted a finger. And what they are proposing will not go far enough. Businesses will continue to close because of energy prices. And this whole debate really frustrates me for a particular reason, because I happen to represent a constituency which is famed for oil and gas production. Somewhat ironically, of course, it was the unionist parties within this chamber who told us in 2014 that oil and gas was running out, and yet now they're telling us there's going to be an addition of 100 new licences given. But barring that irony, is it not absurd that energy-rich Scotland, which produces 6 times more gas than we produce, is even having to face an energy price crisis? When it comes to electricity, gas makes up just 14.4% of our electricity production, but yet the price of that gas dictates all. The fact that the vast majority of our electricity comes from low-carbon sources means absolutely nothing. The fact that it comes primarily from renewables means absolutely nothing when it comes to the costs that are being imposed upon the people of Scotland by this UK government and the continued failure of their energy policy. So if the UK government want to do just one thing, as a suggestion to the new Secretary of State, will this government finally decouple renewables from gas prices? That would make a huge difference, and of course it wouldn't cost a single penny.
Speaker, whilst any help is welcome, this is insufficient by far for the poor and generous in the extreme for the rich. The perversity of an energy-rich Scotland and fuel-poor Scots remains, and what's clear is that not only will people go cold this winter, but some may well die. There should have been a pool freeze. It should have been funded by a windfall tax. There should have been action on VAT. And there are other omissions that haven't been addressed or where clarity remains. Changing the dysfunctional energy market, not just in accelerating nuclear or fracking, and addressing the iniquities that still exist and haven't been touched or at least made clear. First of all, there's prepayment meters. The injustice remains that the poorest, those most deprived, those often most dependent upon the need for power and energy, see themselves paying higher standing charges and higher tariffs. That hasn't been touched, while support has been given to the very wealthy. That must end. It's easily done. A direction to Ofgem, and we all know that the energy companies are capable of delivering it. Similarly, unregulated fuels. Whilst there is a welcome announcement that some action is being taken, if it's simply to be a discretionary fund, then that is inadequate. It is especially the case in the north of Scotland, but it's also the situation in my own constituency, that people are off the gas grid, they're dependent upon heating oil, biomass or other fuels. They shouldn't just be available for some fund they may be able to dip into. They should be regulated. The Secretary should be ensuring that that is done and action should be taken, because those in often the most climatically cold areas are the ones that are going to be suffering. And the dysfunctional system remains. We have seen our electricity system tied to the price of gas. 97% of Scotland's domestic electricity supply is provided by renewables, and yet we are paying sky-high prices dependent upon foreign gas prices, as opposed to renewables that are on our doorstep and over which we have a surfeit. That is perverse, especially when, as has been said by others, Scotland is self-sufficient in gas. This simply rewards the rich. It doesn't address the problems of the poor. It is inadequate. Enough is enough, and this is not enough to end the crisis, nor is it enough to end the action that will be taken by people.
Now let's take the arguments we've heard in this debate against the windfall tax, and let's take them apart one by one. First, the argument that a windfall tax will reduce investment. Is there any truth to this? As my right honourable friend, the Leader of the Opposition, said in his eloquent speech, the BP boss says it won't have an effect on investment. He said, when asked which investments it would affect, he said none of them. So even BP don't believe the argument the Prime Minister is mounting in defence of BP. Next, we've heard the argument that a windfall tax can't raise extra money beyond what the former Chancellor announced. Let us dispose of this argument too, Madam Deputy Speaker. I gather there is a dispute about this 170 billion in excess profits. Well, I say the Chancellor's not here, but I say to the Prime Minister, we'll publish the Treasury's estimate of the excess profits. If it's not 170 billion, we have it on good authority, it is 170 billion. Publish the estimates so we can all see them for ourselves. In case we know, there are tens of billions that could be raised. First of all, there are significant resources from the windfall tax on the oil and gas companies, including abolishing the absurd £5 billion loophole proposed by the Chancellor. Next, there are the electricity generators. Now, we need to de-link the price of gas and electricity, but that will not happen for a number of years. In the meantime, these companies are making enormous profits. Onward, a Conservative think tank, said this week, up to $10 billion a year can be raised. The Tony Blair Institute said $14 billion. We could even have a cross-party consensus on this. Why would we leave this money in their pockets when it could help pay for this action on energy? Now, I say to the government, the alternative which they appear to have adopted is to make a voluntary agreement where the companies decide to opt in to reduce prices. But I do say to the House, this is a terrible proposal. It came originally from Energy UK, because in exchange for giving up some profits now, the deal is to lock in higher prices over the next 15 years. This is not a good deal for consumers, Madam Deputy Speaker. Indeed, there is a chart. Because I'm a nerd, I read these charts. There is a chart published by Energy UK which precisely sets out the fact that consumers will pay through the nose over the 15 years ahead. The third and final argument we've heard in this debate is that, and indeed from the Prime Minister, is it somehow unfair to business. Here I would take advantage of the Prime Minister being here to recommend to her. She reads an article by Mr. Erwin Stelzer, who's a long-time confidant of Rupert Murdoch, and in my experience of Tory leaders, it's worth their while to stay on the right side of him. He wrote this: "Now is the time for a windfall profit tax," he said. "People who believe in capitalism believe that private sector companies should be rewarded for taking risks, not be rewarded for happening to be around when some disruption drives up prices, producing windfalls. In this case, the barbaric invasion of Ukraine." So what is the principle that the Prime Minister is defending here? What is the hill on which she stands? Is the principle she really wishes to defend that oil and gas companies should pocket any scale of profits, however bad the political instability, however large the crisis and however gigantic the windfall, taxation must not change, and that the British people instead must take the strain? That is the effect of her argument. And I do say, Madam Deputy Speaker, the argument I am making is not one simply made by lefty suspects like me. Margaret Thatcher, her heroine, she imposed a windfall tax in 1981. George Osborne, who she worked for, imposed a windfall tax in 2011. So she is flying in the face of logic, fairness, common sense, and engaging in tens of billions of borrowing that she does not need to do. And let me make this point. Let us never, ever again hear lectures from the party opposite on fiscal responsibility after the decisions they are making today.